So Chodesh Tov. Thank you, Babayit, for hosting again. This is it's Rosh Chodesh Adar, and that means that usually Purim is 2 weeks away. It's a little longer this time. But Purim has traditionally become a time that's, people dress up and wear costumes. And I want to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about what it means to pretend to be someone other than yourself, or to put on a disguise, as it were. Hence the title of this year, Masters of Disguise. And I want to start with a couple of introductions. There's more over there, but one page.
Yeah. It started at number one.
So I want to start with a couple introductions, starting with the idea of Carnival. Carnival was an event that happened in a variety of medieval societies, where for a couple of days people would go to this carnival, and they would put on masks, and it was kind of a time for people to do whatever. It involved breaking all kinds of societal norms. And that was sort of the idea behind the mask, was you went and you put on your mask and you became sort of someone else, and you didn't have to worry about societal norms, and you didn't have to worry about who you usually are. You could just sort of let loose the worst parts of yourself. And there's definitely, you see some of that happening on Purim. People are not always their best selves. My personal experiences with it tended to be in the old city when I was in yeshiva, and just the kids were throwing fireworks everywhere. It's incredibly unsafe. But that's like one way of thinking about masks. Is masks are something that disguise who you are, so you don't have to care sort of anymore about the consequences of your actions. The mask itself isn't important so much as it's just a way of obscuring yourself. What we're going to do tonight is I want to compare that a little bit with Rosh Chodesh specifically. He's a Dati Leumi rabbi who died in 2007. I've spoken about him in the last couple classes here. I'm going to look at a text from him, and he's going to be proposing a way of thinking about sort of, dressing up as someone else other than who you are that's very different from that. And he's going to be contrasting it with Rav Kook. I just want to talk for a second about Rav Kook as well. Any questions so far? Great. Rav Kook has a very strong sense that what it means to be a person, what it means to be an individual, is to have a sort of mystical essence. We sort of think of the term neshama. In perhaps more common American discourse, you hear the Chabad term apitala yid, the little spark of a Jew. There's something deep inside you that is who you are, defines you as who you are, and part of that is being Jewish. And so for Rav Kook, to be true to who you are is the ultimate goal of life. He talks about in Orot Tshuva, his book on Tshuva, that the goal of Tshuva is to return to yourself, and then through returning yourself to help society return to its sort of inherent self, and just eventually all of existence, to help it be who it's supposed to be sort of act authentically, is to let your inner self come out. And so for Rav Kook, that's actually what the Torah is. As much as you might think the Torah is like something that external to yourself you're going to, take on and do, for Rav Kook, that's true, but what it is a tool to help you let yourself out. So if Carnival was about putting on a mask to let out the worst of yourself, Rav Kook sees the Torah as, in a sense, putting on a mask to let out the divinity within yourself, to let out the fact that you are in who you most essentially are, a Jew who wants to do Torah mitzvot and serve God. And Rav Chodesh is going to contrast with that, because he is not as certain that we have this sort of essence within us. He says that it made sense for Rav Kook, who grew up in Europe and went to yeshiva in Volozhin, to say, if a Jew is really free, one of the things Rav Kook was very excited about was the possibility of freedom. Holy freedom, he called it, that if a Jew is free and acts freely, they're going to do mitzvot. Rav Chodesh says that makes sense if you grow up in Eastern Europe in the change from the 19th to 20th centuries, and you go study in Volozhin, and that's your whole world. But we live in the 21st century, and that's just not our experience. That when we try and be authentic We see people who acting, they say they are acting authentically or being sincere. They don't always do mitzvot. And so to maintain that today, Rosh Chodesh says, requires sort of lying to yourself. So Rosh Chodesh is very much a student of Rav Kook, and so he spends a lot of time trying to think about, well, freedom is clearly important. Rav Kook said so. And we strongly believe so in the modern world. So what does it mean to be free if it doesn't mean letting out your sort of inner Jew, letting out your inner self? Because it's hard to believe we have that kind of inner self. And in this respect, Rav Kook and Rosh Chodesh are also both very much products of their time. To use the sort of popular terminology, Rav Kook was part of the modern era, and Rosh Chodesh was part of the postmodern era. Rosh Chodesh was very into postmodern philosophy and things. And so part of that is the question of, once again, what does it mean to be an individual? In the modern era, you find a lot of people talking about the importance of the individual. And the individual is the person who does things and changes the world and makes art. And we'll come back to that later, the idea of art and where art comes from. And that's where you find romantic and expressionist models of art. It's all about, the individual taking what's inside themselves and letting it out onto the canvas or the sculpture or whatever. And that's this strong sense of I'm an individual, I have something inside me that makes me who I am, which is a self-contained entity. That's a very sort of modern idea. And postmodernity, one of the ideas associated with that term is that we're really not that self-contained. If you ever hear people debating nature versus nurture, both sides of that say you're put together by something other than yourself. Right? Either nature is what makes you what you are, which you could see as something sort of composed internally, but it really means the genetics you got from your parents. Or nurture, the society outside you affects you and shapes you. And Rav Shigar is going to fall much more in that area. That he says that God puts us in a certain environment so that that environment will shape us and make us who we are in a specific way. That there's not this sort of internal self that's self-contained and we just have to get in touch with it and let it out. We're always interacting with the people around us and the society around us and the values and languages around us, and they shape us in certain ways. So those are my introductions. And from there I want to move straight into Rav Shigar, but once again, just any sort of questions. Okay, so we're going to look at this piece from Rav Shigar. I know we like a little more audience participation, but this one is a little dense, so I'm going to read this one. And then please feel free to stop me if you have questions at any point, but I'll try and explain as we go. So this is actually from a drasha he gave for Pesach, but at the end of it he comes back to Purim, and a contrast between Pesach and Purim. And so he's talking about freedom, which he did on all kinds of occasions, but most particularly around Pesach, which is traditionally associated with freedom and, going out of slavery and things. And he talks about a drasha from Rabbi Nachman, where Rabbi Nachman tries to flip the order of the calendar. Normally the calendar goes from Pesach to Purim. Pesach's the beginning of the year, Purim's the end, roughly. And Rabbi Nachman points out that Parshat Para, which is leads up to Pesach, and so Pesach can't be the beginning. And he uses some sort of language games to get us to say maybe Purim comes first. Purim is actually part of a lead up to Pesach. And what he does there, Rabbi Nachman says, it used to be all the beginnings were from Pesach, Kol HaTchalot Pesach. Now, today, all the beginnings are, and he sort of trails off, and the assumption seems to be all the beginnings are now from Purim. It's also interesting, another rabbi Froman says, right, just the way all mitzvot used to be Zecher L'Yetziat Mitzrayim, now they're like Zecher L'Purim, which is interesting. I think we might do that next time, for anyone who wants to come back. But so Rav Shigar is going to talk about this piece of Torah from Rabbi Nachman and contrast Purim and Pesach with as two different understandings of freedom. So he says, to understand this piece from Rabbi Nachman, we have to distinguish between chofesh and cherut, two different words for freedom. Rabbi Nachman teaches us that chofesh is an introductory step which creates the cherut of Pesach. Purim and Pesach parallel chofesh and cherut. Purim, when we celebrate the watery and man's anarchic freedom, is when we freely choose the freedom of Pesach, of personal essence and identity. It is an experience of Jewishness as a self-enclosed world which finds its justification in itself. It is the experience of divine chosenness. For Rav Kook, the anarchic Purim-style freedom lets us elevate our nature, our Pesach-style freedom. Rabbi Nachman here says otherwise. He says that our anarchic freedom enables us to create chirut freedom. We can create our very nature. This path of creation does not depend on the facts it creates them. Freedom, as Sartre understood it, therefore exists even within holiness. That was a dense set of lines. We sort of added a new idea every line. But he was trying to get at is we have these two terms, chofesh and chirut. And chofesh is not as sort of traditionally positive a word. You find the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, Al tikre chirut elo charut al aluchot, that someone's a ben chorin is really free when you learn Torah. So chirut is a traditional term that is the freedom that's somehow associated with learning Torah. And so Rosh Chodesh is saying that's really what Rav Kook has in mind, is this freedom to be who you are. And that's the freedom of Pesach. Pesach is when we came together as a nation in Yetziat Mitzrayim and gained this sort of identity as God's people, and God gave us the Torah that guides us. And so the freedom of Pesach is the freedom to be who you are. If the more anarchic freedom that he's talking about has any value for that, it's a good thing to choose to be who you are, right? He wants to contrast this chirut freedom with chofesh, what he sees as anarchic freedom that has no rules, the ability to just create without anything guiding you or binding you. And he references here Sartre, the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre's whole idea was, he said, in one of his big ideas, he says, existence precedes essence. There's no essence that precedes your existence, that comes first. Rav Kook is a really good example of someone who says essence precedes existence. That you said you have this essence that is, who you are inside, and then determines, what you're supposed to do and who you should be and things. And Sartre said, no, we, without any sort of anything holding us back or guiding us, decide who we are and can decide who we are. So for Rav Kook, that's not something he really sees as valuable, that, I could just totally choose. That in the abstract, he says you have a person who you are. You have this, Jewishness inside you. And this individual entity, sort of your neshama inside you, you should choose to be that. And so what's special for Rav Shigar here that he's seeing is he sees Rabbi Nachman says that actually Purim, this sort of crazy, chaotic carnival of a hospital, suddenly Rabbi Nachman's making that more dominant than Pesach, the most traditional of most important of the holidays in terms of who we are and why we do what we do. There's so many mitzvot that are Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, and now Rabbi Nachman's making Purim more important. We're in the middle of number one. And for Rav Shigar, he sees that as really the ability to be creative in a just totally new sense. Instead of saying, what it means to be free is to be who you are, he says what it means to be free is to create who you are. That who we are is not this stable, self-contained entity. We can really choose. That instead of, saying I have to sort of get in touch with who I am to go find myself, I would say you can, may decide who you want to be and go make yourself that person. End of the back of the text here, he says, we are therefore faced with two paths. There's the path of be who you are. There's also a more radical path, the ability to create your freedom, your I. Perhaps this is what Rabbi Nachman meant by the cryptic line that appears at the end of the teaching. For in the beginning, all the beginnings began at Pesach. And therefore the mitzvot are all in memory of the exodus from Egypt. But now, today, all the beginnings are from Purim. And now we, for Shigar, this is sort of the transition from the modern to postmodern era, as you put it. That in the new postmodern time, we really believe that there's not this strong sense of who we are, that who we are is constructed by society and our parents and all the things that influences us. But one of the things that means is that we can consciously change who we are. It's not for nothing I threw out that line about, go find yourself. I think a lot about what makes us, feel like we're doing the right thing. It's often very hard to feel like we're doing the right thing. There's something I've felt, and you often hear people talking about is, oh, I have to go find myself. I have to figure out who I am, to get in touch with myself. It's definitely true. I don't know if everyone here went to some sort of gap year program or yeshiva or seminary or whatever, but certainly when I was in yeshiva, there was a lot of talk about figuring yourself out and finding out who you are and things like that, which all come from the same way of thinking that Rav Kook is talking about you have some sort of true entity in yourself that you have to uncover, that it's already there and you just need to figure it out. And one of the things it leads to is you, particularly if you're you are in part of some sort of larger framework like yeshiva or seminary, where while you want to get in touch with yourself, you also want to be participating with everyone else in learning or just social gatherings. You have to get in touch with yourself and hope that who you are inside matches what's happening outside. For me, it was always, you deep inside you want to get up and daven in the morning. So, but I am not a morning person. So who I am does not want to do that. So you end up in a sort of a state of tension there. And for me, it was really a very powerful experience to read Rosh Chodesh and hear, no, I could recognize that I'm not who I want to be. That in a sense, who I am already isn't my best self, isn't who I could possibly be. That instead of trying to determine who I already am, and say that if I look inside myself and discover I like sleeping in, that for a cook that's wrong. For a cook, if you discover you don't like getting up in the morning to daven, or you don't like doing mitzvot inherently, you're wrong. You need to get more in touch with yourself. And I found it very powerful to say, no, I could actually recognize that I'm not as good a person as I would hope to be, but I can make myself better. Any thoughts or questions so far? What do people think about this? Do you think that you have someone inside yourself that it makes sense to you, that there's certain things you do that right, this is just flows for me naturally? Or do you think you're more likely to sort of use the Torah as a guidebook, like, oh, I want to make myself into the kind of person who does these things?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. Like, I think that there are certain things that are in our nature that we just do them just because they come natural to us. But I also agree with the idea that we should always be striving to be something better, that we could always improve. In terms of our mental.
No, I mean, I think there's kind of always some sort of tension. I don't know if I might be going in Rav Kook's direction or not, because I do kind of feel like there are certain things that a person does that for whatever reason they feel connected to, and it might not be something that they can explain, meaning why am I interested in this and not interested in that? Oftentimes we don't really have an articulated reason as to why this interests me and this doesn't interest me, meaning I'm very interested in getting into a classroom and teaching kids. Somebody else is really interested in getting to a hospital, being a doctor. I have no interest in that, and they have no interest in what I'm doing. How can we explain why it is that I'm here and they're there? Meaning, I do feel like there are certain things that kind of beyond us, but on the other hand, I just also feel part of the I don't want to say chisaron in Rav Kook's whatever. It's another thing that I'm not really. It doesn't really sit well with me. Is to come and tell somebody, meaning you don't really know, meaning this is who you are really, and you just have to come to it yourself. Meaning you're shooting the arrows and then putting the target where the arrows fell. And it's kind of just every person is so incredibly complex that they go from the nikudat hanacha that if you open the right doors, might be different doors for every person, but eventually you'll end up at the same place. Kind of seems like an oversimplification almost of where you
I don't know, but to me it sounds like he's saying that everybody has who they are and who they could strive to be, which is sometimes could be a different,
Who's saying? Rav Kook or Rav Shagar? Or
what Rav Kook is saying.
So Rav Kook would say that when you're striving to get in touch with your deepest sort of self, that who you really are inside. And Rav Shagar is really trying to sort of turn us outwards. That we're not looking in anymore to see who am I inside and trying to figure out who I am inside. But to return to the discussion of masks, he was saying, like, no, you just put on a mask. Like, I choose to be someone other than, who you might be or might not be even. You just don't worry as much about what's happening behind the mask and make sure it's sort of a mask you want to be putting forward. In a sense, it doesn't matter as much if I want to be a good person as much as if I just choose to be a good person in practice, and that develops over time. This is actually how he defines, usually, the phrase Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shemayim. What it means to really accept the yoke of God's kingship is to choose to make yourself into someone who follows the Torah. That it's not just sort of, in the broadest sense, submit to God, and it's not to recognize that you're someone who already internally believes in God and wants to do mitzvot, and I think it's to choose to shape yourself and build your whole life around the Torah. And it's really much more less about going in or seeing what's already true, as much as building forward and creating something. Any more thoughts or questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Are we assuming that they're assuming that there's a sense of desire to do mitzvot, to be a Jewish person, I guess.
Right, so that's definitely Rav Kook's assumption, to the point where if you don't feel that desire, it's because you're sort of disconnected from yourself. He has this really phenomenal piece in Rosh Chodesh that starts with a line from Yechezkel. Yechezkel starts out saying, Yad Hashem haita alai, the hand of God was upon me, v'ani b'toch hagolah, and I was in the exile. And of course, ha'ani haita b'golah, the I was in exile. The sense that who I am has actually been exiled from my life, and I have to get back, bring that back from exile and get back in touch with who I really am in order to do mitzvot. And he goes through, in that piece, famous sins of the Jewish people, like Chet HaMarishon, the sin of the golden calf. I think there might be some more. So those are prime examples of when the Jewish people were not acting based on who they are inside. He basically says that the only reason Adam Harishon and Chava sinned was because they listened to a voice outside themselves. Right? That's the way that story works. Is they sin because they listen to the snake. So it was going outside yourself leads to sin for Rav Kook. And if you really truly listen to yourself, there's no way they would have eaten it. They would have, they would have done what they're supposed to do, not eaten it. So he really does think if you're in touch with yourself, you'll have the sort of natural desire to do mitzvot. And in the absence of that, it just means that you're out of touch with yourself. Okay, so I want to do a second piece here, not from Rav Shigar. This is from a sociologist named Adam Seligman. He's Jewish. He's written a lot of really interesting things. This is an article he wrote called "Ritual, the Self, and Sincerity."
Oh, Jews, huh?
And it's an article on the respective roles of ritual and sincerity in defining who we are and in society writ large. It's really a fascinating article. I'm happy to send it to anyone who wants to tell me after the class. And I think it's useful for thinking about this idea from Rav Shigar and thinking about the role the Torah plays in determining sort of who we are, and this creative possibility Rav Shigar is talking about. He says, to invoke ritual, then, is not to eschew change. It is, however, to value the past, to give credence to tradition, to accept that we, each and every one of us, are not the beginning and end of existence. It's to articulate a vision of autonomy that does not stand in negation of the past, but one where, as in the Jewish practice, the ways of our fathers are in our hands. Maseh avatenu b'yadeinu. Ritual, in fact, continues to provide an ongoing arena of creativity and tradition, acceptance and obligation. Ritual practice becomes the arena where the dynamic of that third space, the potential space within which cultural creativity takes place, is worked out. I'll pause in the middle for a second. He's sort of responding to, I think, critiques that you hear a lot, and I definitely identified with, less now, but I remember a time when I really identified with, I'm only going to do things that speak to me or that make sense to me. I'm not going to do, just whatever someone tells me to do. And it's a really strong value in contemporary Western culture. I think it became all the stronger after the Holocaust, when there's a lot of talk about what it means to just do something because someone told you to do it. It's not at all simple to say that obedience is a good thing, even if you're, the most traditional Jew. But we have a very strong sense that, like, what it means to be true to yourself, or to be part of being a good person, is doing things because you think you should do them, not because it's this just set of actions that was outside you, that a list of actions for you to fulfill that you just decide to participate in or born into. And Seligman really wants to critique that point of view, and what he really wants to say is that it's a very shallow understanding of both who we are as people and what ritual is. And part of it is this line, right? He says it means to give value the past, to give credence to tradition, to accept that we, each and every one of us, are not the beginning and end of existence. That in the sort of the modernist model of the self that we were talking about, where you're this self-contained entity, saying that there's nothing outside you that really makes claims on who you are. You're not part of anything bigger than yourself. You stand outside it, and you can decide what's right and what's wrong. And really, I think, and this is part of what Seligman's saying, we live in a world, we live in a society that affects us and shapes who we are. And part of that is recognizing we participate in that. Like a really good example of that is when you see someone and you say, "Hi, how you doing?" Or you shake their hand, or whatever your typical greeting is, because almost all of us do that exactly the same way. It feels weird when we don't do it, but those aren't things that we do because they're like, "Oh, I decided this is the right thing to do." That's a social ritual. That's a practice we take part in because it's part of our society. And it's part of our society in a way that shapes our society in a good way. We believe in being part of a society where you greet someone and you ask about them, and we don't always listen to the answer the way we should. We don't mean it so much when we say it, but it's part of being, and part of a society with positive social values. Right, so saying that ritual in that sense is innately part of who we are. It's also a realm of creativity. You can say hi however you want. And in the context of mitzvot, of Maaseh Avotenu B'Yadeinu, the fact that we have the same actions that were passed down. Yes, but it doesn't mean that we don't change those actions over time in small ways. There's not as many as room for creativity. For people who wear tzitzit, that's a place that often comes up. If you people who decide to wear tchelet or not, or how they want to tie it, that kind of thing. Really, mitzvot can give us a lot of opportunities for creativity. Not in the least about why you do it. Why do you do a mitzvah? Right? One of the few things that the tradition has never really decided needed to be done for a specific needed to be settled finally is why we do mitzvot. You can use any mitzvah for sort of any meaning, and if you read any book about the meaning of mitzvot, they're all going to say something different. Because mitzvot are not about one specific meaning so much as they're a realm for us to bring God into our lives in whatever way that works out. Rav Soloveitchik has a really good critique of Rambam in this respect. Rambam says Rambam tried to make all of the mitzvot about specific historical needs. They're supposed to serve really specific roles. It's that. There's a reason nobody thinks that today. That nobody's like, oh, what are the reason that we needed mitzvot in order to combat ancient culture? Because mitzvot play a powerful and creative role in our individual lives. And that's sort of where this aspect of tradition and creativity comes in, that it provides a realm for creativity. And I said I was going to get back to art, so that's the continuation of this passage right here. Here's an analogy with the world of art I think is very appropriate. For artistic production certainly flows along similar lines, and while the world of post-romantic artistic production in Western Europe is one where the aesthetic experience is almost equated with the individual expressionism, there have been millennia of human aesthetic production that developed exactly along the lines outlined here in terms of ritual. In fact, even the production of icons, that most formalistic and circumscribed of genres, has been shown to exhibit personal and idiosyncratic traits of each iconographer. In that context, we can speak of the individual artist existing within the tradition. It may even be appropriate to talk of the individual artistic creation existing only through a tradition. We don't live in a vacuum, and we don't create in a vacuum. If we want to talk about the ability to decide what actions are right and wrong, we don't do that by sitting alone in a room and thinking up what's right and what's wrong. We do that by examining all of the actions we are taught and experience and we see other people doing, and judging them and saying, what should I do and what do I not do? And the same thing is true with art. We make art by reference to all of the pieces of art we've seen before and the things we've seen in the world that we might want to recreate, and the way we're taught to hold a paintbrush or draw with a crayon or just throw paint at a wall. We all pick up cues from the actions we've already seen, and so what it actually means to be creative is not to create yesh me'ayin, something out of nothing. It's to figure out how to put things together in a new way, to do something new within the context of something old. And that's really where Rosh Chodesh, I think, is coming from, is this ability to create ourselves. What does it mean to create ourselves? And to create ourselves as a form of Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shemayim means to figure out how to make Torah the dominant focus in our life in a way that's just us, putting old things together in new ways. Any thoughts, questions, comments?
There's I don't know if it's a medrash or if it's like a Hasidish whatever it is, but like the pasuk that says Zei Livan Vei Elohei Aviva Romamenu. So the second part of the pasuk is Elohei Aviva Romamenu, meaning there's certain things that I do because my fathers did them, and because God is also the God of my fathers, and so there's a certain amount of Romemu, there's a certain amount of exaltedness that I experience about God because of where I came from. But the noi, and the hidur mitzvah, because what the Gemara learns from that pasuk exactly, that it's hidur mitzvah, comes from my personal experience of ze'eli ve'anvehu, meaning the fact that I'm connected with who God is personally. That's where the noi comes from. So meaning I have the form from my fathers, but at a certain level, the content is kind of coming from me.
Right, I think also that connects to this idea of the creative aspect of what I do with the materials my fathers have given me, is very much that personal aspect of it. So part of it, and I think this is important in terms of how we do Purim, not just this broader question of, who do we want to be and how do we decide that. In fact, that Rosh Chodesh, I say we should make that a conscious choice. Instead of saying, I'll just, be who I am, or working hard to figure out who you already are, you say, make yourself who you want to be. But what I'm trying to do with this paragraph is take it down to practical questions, right? Ritual is part of how we participate in a society. We make conscious choices about how we do that. So, because of the context of the Purim shiur, I was thinking very much like how we do Purim. That Purim can be a really sort of beautiful time for creating social spaces based on giving and laughing together and sharing and celebrating. And they can unfortunately be very unhealthy social spaces based on people getting drunk and fighting in unhealthy ways, and the fireworks I mentioned before. That the way we participate in rituals isn't just has a practical effect, but it says a lot about this kind of society we want to create. That even if you're throwing fireworks at nobody in particular, you're still trying to create a society where people throw fireworks and where you don't care about people who might get hurt. Okay, there's no other comments. I do have a second part of this shiur here that's going to talk a little more about the general question of sincerity, of the possibility of taking off a mask or impossibility. And we're going to start with a Gemara from Brachot. The Gemara, Rabban Gamliel used to run the Beit Midrash, and what happened when they stopped him and why. Does anyone want to read number 3?
I could try.
Go for it.
It was taught on that day that dismissed the guard at the door, and permission was granted to the students to enter. For Rabban Gamliel had proclaimed, any student who's inside is not like his outside may not enter the study hall. On that day, several benches were added. Rabbi Yochanan said, Abba Yosef ben Dostai, and the rabbi disputed this. One said 400 benches were added, and one said 700 benches were added.
Dostai, the street.
Yeah.
Is that it? Or should I keep going?
That's it. Right, so this is the main part of a passage of Gemara about when Rabban Gamliel was, deposed from his role on top of the Beit Midrash. When they said he doesn't get to decide anymore what happens, and his standard, which we'll come back to in a second, was that you have to be on the outside like you are on the inside. That there should be, who you really are inside should be reflected in your activities on the outside. And when that stops being the standard for being allowed to come study Torah, they say, several benches were added, 400 benches were added, 700 benches were added. And the way the Gemara continues also is that it's not just about, now more people can come study. Because first they say lots more nice things. They say, maybe they're just being nice. Really, Rabban Gamliel was right. He said, no, there was a whole Seder of Mishnah that was created on that day, and Rabban Gamliel himself came back to study in this Beit Midrash. That is something. Just the idea of being Toho Keboro is, if not, I wouldn't say it's not a value, but it's not this important driving value that needs to determine how we do Torah and who gets to participate in Torah and mitzvot. This idea of Tochel Kiboro is what we call sincerity. The idea that you're going to express who you are honestly. And that Gemara always bothered me because, as I said earlier, what if you're not a good person but you want to be? The idea that you should be exactly the same on the outside as you are on the inside is definitely, it's good to be a good person on the inside and the outside, but I would think it'd be more important to be a good person on the inside, even if you're a bad person on the outside, or reverse, to be a good person on the outside, even if you're a bad person on the inside, than to be, bad both inside and outside, but at least you're being honest. That if you're a bad person, but you consciously choose to do good things, that means you're already sort of on the way to being a good person, and that's much better than saying, no, I'm a bad person, I'm not going to try and be good, which is sort of the logical conclusion of saying you have to be Toho Kiboro. You have to be on the inside and the outside exactly the same. And we have another paragraph here from the Adam Seligman article. Anyone want to read number 4?
Sure. The sincere motive behavior seeks to replace the mere convention of ritual with a genuine and thoughtful state of internal conviction. Rather than becoming what we do in action through ritual, we do according to what we have become through self-examination. This form of thought emphasizes tropes of authenticity, and each individual thus takes on an enormous responsibility.
So he's essentially laying out what it means to be Toho Kiboro. What it means to be concerned with the issue of sincerity is to be really deeply concerned that you act based on who you are inside. It requires, extensive self-examination. You say, who am I really? What do I want? What are the things I think are valuable? And what are the actions I think are appropriate? And then you act based on those things. Instead of the ritual model we talked about before, where, I'm just going to shape all of those things, shape who I am and what I want by doing certain actions and participating in certain social conventions. And he says it takes on an enormous responsibility. You've made yourself the person who can decide what's right and what's wrong, and who can really know yourself. And it really, I think, runs into a big problem as well, which is that you can't actually know yourself entirely. The question of what do I want is not something we can answer all the way, all the time. Sometimes you do have a strong desire, I want this thing. But it runs into a problem when it comes to a question of, am I being honest? If you think about, you can't ever ask someone if they're lying to you, because that assumes that they're going to answer truthfully. If you don't know if someone's lying to you, you can't ask them to explain it, right? Are you lying to me doesn't get you an answer that's helpful. So what are the question of, am I lying to myself? You have the same problem. If you're already worried that you don't know yourself well, your own wondering about yourself is going to have the same problem. You can never get outside the problem of, you can't answer the question of, am I lying? So that creates a problem for authenticity, because if you can't know who you are entirely, you have to at some point sort of take it on faith. Same way you have to at some point trust that someone's telling you the truth. Then it becomes much harder to act authentically, because you at some point say, "Oh, I
reflect your authenticity." Yeah.
exactly." You can't reflect on yourself to an end point. You just reflect on yourself forever. And so, hopefully, eventually, if you want to act, you can just decide, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to act, and that's already gotten us back to the creative action, as opposed to sincere trying to express yourself through the things you're doing. So, thoughts, comments? Too much, too abstract? No? Okay. We're going to look at another piece from Rosh Chodesh. This one is from one who's just out for Purim, more appropriately, not Pesach this time. This one was actually translated not by me, which is the other one. This one was a book of translations put out in his lifetime. One of the things that means is it's a little dense, both because the early drashot that were put out were dense in Hebrew, and the translations were also dense. But it's, I think, a really interesting piece, and it deals with this question: like, what do you do with the fact that we can't ever answer, and to answer entirely the question, am I being honest with myself? How do you, be religious if you don't know if you're being honest? Particularly if we think about religion as being about, the values we hold in our relationship with God as a very internal thing. What do you do when you can't know what's going on inside yourself entirely? So he's going to approach this issue through the lens of disguise and Yaakov and Esav. You say, Yaakov was the first person to disguise himself in the Torah, but he's also, and this is a necessary introduction, he's going to discuss the idea that maybe Esav was also disguised. The Torah says that Yitzchak loved Esav kitzaid befiv, which means the food that he would trap was in Yitzchak's mouth. And the Midrash reads that and says, kitzaid befiv, that he had trapped Yitzchak with his mouth. That Esav had lied to Esav, sort of disguised who he was, in order to, trick him and into loving him. He says the Midrash says he does that by basically being extra machmir, pretending to be meiser on salt and teva. Yeah, he's asking, saying we should do maser on things, or how do I do maser on things that don't need maser? So by being, having lots of chumras, he convinced Yitzchak that he was really very righteous and religious. So Rosh Chodesh says, the first person we meet in the Bible to wear a disguise is Yaakov. Yaakov assumes the guise of Esav, his brother, his enemy. The voice is the voice of Yaakov, but the hands are the hands of Esav. Yaakov's hands are wrapped in goat skin, the same goat that will be cast to Azazel on Yom Kippur. And Rosh Chodesh likes to point out that there are two goats on Yom Kippur. They get different treatment, but nothing exactly the same, nothing obvious to distinguish them. So that's where we're heading with this Yaakov and Esav question is, they're both disguised, how do we distinguish them? He also wears the garb of Esav, his outer appearance, in order to win the blessings of his father. For a game was in his mouth. Esav's power lies in his mouth. Esav also inherits Yaakov's voice. He wraps himself in his voice, the sound of the Torah. Esav lacks the truth of Yaakov. Yaakov, in Kabbalistic symbols, is the symbol for Emet, also in the Midrash, as well as in the Kabbalah, and Tiferet, yes. So, Esav lacks the truth of Yaakov. All his actions are false. All are done merely for the sake of appearance. But he dares to be Yaakov. This is the religiosity of this world, religiosity founded on lies. Yaakov impersonates Esav, who impersonates Yaakov, back and forth. Religious truth in this world appears firmly secular. The large measure of self-negation that true religiosity demands from its garb, from its adherents, seems to arouse stern judgment, midat hadin's opposition. The righteous must then clothe himself in the garb of false external religiosity so that he may appear as a tzaddik in this world. Not only in order to gain from the material world must he lie, but even in order to retain his persona of spirituality. If he would be true to himself, he would not be thought of as righteous, nor would he be able to act in the world as such. He gives up that most dear to him, his own inner self, in order to be understood by others. The wicked attempt to imitate his garb, making a mockery of his righteousness itself. Dressed the part, the wicked man does not feel the absurdity of his situation. Judging by all external appearances, he truly believes that he is one of the righteous. The trickery of Esav is not simple. It's not conscious subterfuge, but runs much deeper than that. It is utter self-deception. He sees this world as true. He identifies reality with mere appearances. From his point of view, the attempts to find favor in his father's eyes are honest. They even bear fruit. The side of strict judgment, Midat Hadin, the source of this world, is satisfied with his efforts. Only the truth tzaddik is capable of seeing through the facade of the wicked. But one cannot expose him lest he himself be seen as one of the wicked as well. So this is like a really crazy piece of Torah. The first time I read it, I didn't understand it. Many times later, I understood it, but thought it was like absolutely insane. And I think eventually it started to make some more sense to me. I want to jump into back in the middle of the piece, to look at what I think is the key and the craziest part. So, let's just read the second paragraph from the top. So Yaakov impersonates Esav, who impersonates Yaakov, back and forth. Here we are. Religious truth in this world appears firmly secular. The large measure of self-negation that true religiosity demands from its adherents seems to arouse stern judgment's opposition. The righteous must then clothe himself in the garb of false external religiosity, so that he may appear as a tzaddik in this world. Not only in order to gain from the material world must he lie, but even in order to retain his persona of spirituality. Okay, so the starting point of this idea is what the Kabbalah calls this world, Alma de Shikra, Olam HaSheker, the world of falsehood. That there's something about this world that is inherently false. And that, Rosh Chodesh is saying, is this issue of you can never know, am I being truthful? Am I really, really honest? I think something that makes a lot more sense in terms of the way we think about like subconscious drives and desires and the things that motivate us that we're not aware of all the time. That you can't ever know why you're doing something entirely. So if we think about religion as something sort of totally internal, we run into the problem of not being able to really trust our inner lives. And we can't, ever finish asking, am I being honest? Am I really doing this for God? Maybe I'm just doing it for social respect. Maybe I'm Esav, who's doing it for his father's love, but Rosh Chodesh doesn't know he's doing it for his father's love. You have to clothe yourself in the garb of false external religiosity. He says that we usually think, I'm a religious person, therefore I do mitzvot. Mitzvot are this garb of false external religiosity, right? There's something I pick up from outside myself because I'm a religious person. But there's something arbitrary about that. We all know or, think we know people who don't seem religious even though they do all the mitzvot. You're like, you are really strict about stuff, but you're not a good person. And some of that is ignoring our own faults, and some of it's really true. And the hardest part about it, Rosh Chodesh is pointing out, is some of the people really think that they're very religious people. You ask them, they would not say, right, I just do that for social reasons, but it's not who I am. They say, no, of course, what do you mean? This is the most important thing in the world. And they are just, like all of us, blind to their own flaws. And so, what Rosh Chodesh is saying is that there's something problematic in this world of trying to make religiosity just about our inner lives, because we don't know. So if we have some sort of thing that we dedicate ourselves to, and that's religion, something outside ourselves, that gives us something that's much more concrete. We can know that's sort of like what it means to be religious. It does create the problem of people who are, not religious, who do religious things. And the crazy thing Rosh Chodesh says here is that's what it means to be Yaakov, is to recognize that one, religious life and the inner life is important, and two, it's hard to know. That we can't ever know that we're really being, the most purely motivated. So where Asaph only has the first one. He's like, oh, I'm a very religious person inside. That's why I do mitzvot, because I'm very religious. Yaakov says, I do mitzvot, and I like to think it's because I'm very religious, but also I know, to quote Pirkei Avot, you can't trust yourself until the day you die. Part of just being a person in the world is I have motivations that I have parts of myself that are not transparent to me. And that's what he says about Asaph, that Asaph is, self-deceptive. That as much as he is entrapping Yitzchak and convincing Yitzchak to love him, he's also convinced himself that he's being honest. And recognizing that we don't always do things for the right reasons is a good way to connect it back to the piece from Adam Seligman above, is a good reason not to make ourselves the arbiters of what's right and wrong. That there's a value to participating in something larger than ourselves and not just deciding based on what I feel is right. Because what I feel is right changes over time, and what I feel is right might have bad motivations that I'm not even necessarily aware of. Thoughts, questions before we move on?
I have a question.
Yes.
When he says religious truth in this world appears firmly secular, like what's an example of that?
So I have a couple of possibilities for what that might mean, depending on what exactly he's talking about at any 1 minute. So religious truth in this world appears firmly secular could be sort of a drawing out of the phrase false external religiosity. That what in this world people think is religious truth as like actions are in a sense secular, because you could give tzedakah for secular reasons. You could pick up branches and fruits and wave them around for secular reasons. You'd be a crazy person, but you could do it. That mitzvot don't have to be religious. What I think it's getting at is that religious truth appears firmly secular in this world, because in this world, there's sometimes where we judge religion by actions, and the inner religious truth is something that is almost secular, because when it is disconnected from actions. So if you're a tzaddik, you could be someone who's just the most religious and the best person internally, but it's not manifest in religious actions, people would evaluate you and judge you to be secular. That part of living in the world isn't just having your own sort of personal relationship with God. It's participating in the religious community. I'm in the middle of writing my thesis on Rav Shigar and Franz Rosenzweig. And Franz Rosenzweig has a fascinating book called The Conversions of Franz Rosenzweig that talk a lot about his early religious issues. And one of the things he, at a very early age, he would eventually consider converting to Christianity for like 3 months, and it was really torturous sort of months for him. But he had a very compelling experience with one of his Christian friends, and eventually decided to remain Jewish. But right before that, a lot of his early sort of theology was actually, he felt like maybe we're supposed to die for God. That this world is, he admitted this was a sort of very Christian mindset he ended up in. That if all that matters is sort of our personal inner relationship with God, it doesn't make any sense that we're in this world with other people and that religion involves other people. That in a certain understanding of religiosity, all that matters is you are devoted to God. But that all happens inside you, and if you believe, that the most religious part of you is a soul that persists after death, then why on earth would you be in this world? Kierkegaard famously sort of said, the Christians are all supposed to sort of die off for God. It was a good thing. And that inner, religious truth appears secular from the perspective of a, religion that affirms the necessity of acting in the world. That we, sort of as a community that has certain public standards of religiosity, we think what it means to be religious is to participate on a public level in actions and things. Wear a kippah, dress the right way. That someone who doesn't do those things, even if they're a perfect tzaddik sort of internally, will think they're totally secular.
Do you think people, there were people who were successful in doing
I don't think there was ever anyone who was successful in both for any significant period of time. And that, I think, goes back to this general issue we're talking about here of who we are on the inside is murky and amorphous and changing over time. And really the internal aspect is something that I think for most of us comes and goes. Sometimes we're motivated and internally to do certain things, sometimes other things, sometimes nothing at all, sometimes everything. I don't think that it's
If that's
ever...
a reality, then like, what should the expectation be? Like, did he ever map out exactly like what's in practice? Like, because I feel like he's like, kind of talking about the problem.
Well, no, I think that's exactly. I think that's the question of the like Esav or Yaakov is about two things, and they're connected. One is self-awareness, right? Yaakov was aware that he wasn't necessarily there internally. In terms of doing, he wasn't necessarily internally motivated to do all of the actions, and Esav was not aware. But the corresponding part of that is you should accept that you are. So not always going to be that way. You're not always going to want to do every mitzvah. You're not always going to feel internally driven. I think about a lot. There's this fascinating Rambam. But so okay, at the end of learning Pirkei Avot, people usually recite a Mishnah or Kiva ben I'm messing that up. Whatever. The Mishnah is God wanted to give zchut to Bnei Yisrael. Chanani ben Akasha. There we are. I always mess that one up. That God wanted to give zchut merit to Bnei Yisrael, so He gave them lots of mitzvot. And a couple.
We hit every time after.
Yeah. So, like, what does giving lots of mitzvot have to do with giving Bnei Yisrael merit? I think the most obvious answer is more opportunities to get merit, more mitzvot, more merit. But Rambam, the way he explains it, and he expounds on this at length in the Mor Nevuchim, the third section, in I think, the 34th chapter, he says, the mitzvot are rules for a society. Everyone has to follow them. People are individuals. Things will not always fit well for us. In fact, he talks about, if he sees the mitzvot as meant to improve us as people, which means they have to talk to someone who's maybe on a low level and help raise them up. But if you're already on a high level, and the mitzvah talking to you on a low level could actually be harmful. So they could, push you backwards. Where he says, nope, mitzvah are rules for everyone. And because we change over time, sometimes, and we're different people, well, sometimes one mitzvah will be better, sometimes another mitzvah will be better. We all have to find whatever that mitzvah is that works best for us, and really work on that one. Because the other ones we have to do as best we can. But recognizing, and there's a question of what are the standards and the requirements, what do you think are reasonable expectations? For a reasonable expectation, everyone, does the best they can in all the mitzvot. Find the one that works for you. That is going to be your mitzvah, that you can really do. Because the probability is, not every mitzvah is going to work for you. Some of them are going to be hard for you. Some of them might distract you. And make a really good example for me, and I'm certain lots of other people, is davening with other people. I find davening with other people most of the time is just distracting. People around is not easy to focus on what's happening. Rabbi Nachman has this great piece where he talks about you can't ever daven around someone who gave you something. Because you're always worried about, I have to give him back. Is he looking at me and wondering if I'm going to give it back what he gave me? I owe him something. I'm dependent on him. Then he says, but that's why none of us can ever pray around anyone else, because we're always getting social respect and depending on other people for respect and dignity and the honor they give us. And we interact with people and they don't spit on us. They're nice to us and treat us like people who have value. We always are conscious of other people looking at us and judging us. So we can't ever daven around other people for Rabbi Nachman. He doesn't say you shouldn't, but you can't really daven. So in a sense, the fact that we have to daven with other people, given the opportunity, it's something I do, but it's something that makes it hard for me to daven. So davening in a minyan is not my thing. It's not, my mitzvah. I don't know if I have something right now I would define as my mitzvah. For years, it was tzitzit. I had a couple of mitzvah tzitzit with tchelet on them, and I was very excited and careful with them all the time, and I tied them myself, and I tied them for other people, and it's something I was very passionate about, something I was very driven to participate in. But what Rambam was saying, you shouldn't have an expectation that every mitzvah is going to work for you all the time. I think the same thing is sort of true with Rosh Chodesh here. You shouldn't have an expectation, I'm going to feel passionately driven to do mitzvot and every mitzvah and everything all the time. I can do mitzvot without feeling like this is an important part of my relationship with God, because you don't always feel like that. What it is part of the series, the mitzvot that we do, and sometimes you feel them, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you feel some of them, sometimes you don't, etc. Is that great? So I want to look at one last piece from the Adam Seligman article, and really, once again, it's a phenomenal article. I highly recommend it. If you want it, I'll send it to you. Let me know. And this is going to go down to the question of the way ritual really helps us deal with this problem of it's hard to sort of know who we are and to decide things like that absolutely and be totally honest with ourselves. Ritual concentrates on the performative nature of the act rather than on its denotative meaning. It concentrates on the creative function of the action rather than the sort of idea that it conveys as pre-existing. In fact, pure ritual puts questions of belief or truth aside in favor of the shared world that its actions create and require. The very external performative aspects of ritual, especially its repetition and recollection of places and times not given to purely rational or instrumental computation, give it a unique lability. Lability means emotional expression. Thus does ritual encompass the ambiguity of life in a unique manner. It allows one to play with such ambiguity in a manner precluded by an undue concern with the authenticity of one's actions and beliefs. Ritual unshackles the mind from a need to believe in a dogma of our choosing as long as we act properly. That last line is just amazing. In contrast to often we think of ritual as things you don't believe in are a sort of slavery and just blind obedience. No, they actually have something very freeing about them. When we think we have to decide what's true and false and what is the exact right thing to be doing at this moment, I am in a bind. I'm in trouble if I can't figure it out. You could spend forever trying to figure it out, and until you do, you're just stuck there. What do? And ritual allows you to say, I don't actually know what I should do right now. I'm not sure what the best thing is to do, and that's okay. That if I don't have it all figured out right now, I already know what I'm supposed to do. That is, I think, maybe where we come back to that creativity question of when you do think you know what you could do, you can be creative within ritual and stuff. But very often we don't. We don't have a strong sense of what I think is the right thing to do right now. And I think certainly if we're talking about our level of religious passion and fervor changes over time, this puts that aside and puts it. When you're not feeling it, you ask yourself, am I feeling it? Do I feel like getting up and going to davening today? Do I feel like I should be davening with the minions important to me right now? Do I feel like davening at all is important to me right now? And if you don't know, if you don't have an answer to that question, you're kind of stuck. You go, I could, I don't have to, I don't know. Ritual, participating in a set of actions outside ourselves, puts that aside. Because you don't actually have to know in order to act. You're not acting entirely sincerely, but that's okay. Because that's, as Rosh Chodesh said, that's sort of how we are in this world. And then it also gets back to your thing that participating in rituals actually helps shape who you are as a person. But before, I don't want to get up in the morning and daven, or I don't know if I do or not. You can make yourself into that kind of person over time. If you know, I keep coming back to that issue. It's a recurring one for me. Something else I think is very interesting here, and he references this more explicitly in a different part of the essay. He's talking about the creation of here's the external performative aspects of ritual, especially its repetition and recollection of places and times not given to purely rational or instrumental computation. He references elsewhere the Pesach Seder. This is everyone needs to see themselves ki'ilu yatzam mi'Mitzrayim, as if they had gone out of Egypt. The creation of as-if spaces is an important function of mitzvot. That when we do mitzvot, we participate together in things that are zeicher l'tziat Mitzrayim. We bring that story to life in our world. Ultimately, without having to do the question of is this historically true or not, right? If you are someone who's at all interested in questions of the history of Yetziat Mitzrayim, then you get into questions like, well, what did it exactly look like? Did it look exactly like the Torah, or similar, or not at all? Or people are going to say that didn't happen at all. The ritual actually suspends that. It's not I'm not sure Yetziat Mitzrayim happened, so I can't do any mitzvah zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. There's rituals are about acting that out and performing that and trying to create both yourself and your social sphere and your collective group of people doing the mitzvot as a people for whom that's a reality, that Yetziat Mitzrayim and everything that it implies is a reality. And I think that when it comes to sort of any of those questions, any question of belief, which we're inherently going to just believe more strongly or less strongly over time, just based on what's happening to us and how we're feeling, I think it's very powerful for to realize that the ability to put on a mask, to pick up the Torah and mitzvot not as something that I believe in 100% in every aspect of it all the time, but as something I pick up and take with me consciously from the outside in instead of from the inside out, is a way of granting yourself a framework and a set of actions and guided action, ordered way of living your life while dealing with all of those questions at various points over time in different ways. More thoughts and questions? Anyone think I'm a heretic and I should leave?
I have a thought.
Yes.
So with this understanding of Rosh Chodesh and the rituals, what actively how does one strive to be a better Jew if you kind of can feel settled with how you are?
So one, I would say that I think much like the Rav Kook piece or Rav Shiur piece at the beginning, where he gave a couple different models, it might be that the best thing to do is sort of mix this accepting yourself model with a model that strives more for inner truth. And I think
you wouldn't say so much to remain stagnant the rest of the time.
Right. So I think that on one level you could say what he's doing is giving you a basic level of acceptance, right? Self-acceptance would be his phrase. Kabbalat Tzmitz. That you recognize I'm never going to know myself entirely. I'm sometimes not going to be totally motivated to my will, and that's just makes it so that you're not stressed out about not being totally passionately engaged with Judaism at all times. And then once you have the basic level of acceptance, then you work on it consciously, but you're not afraid of failure anymore. But also,
when you're in that place to accept it, but then the hope or the assumption is that you're still striving outside of those moments.
Right. In a certain sense, it gives you a better way to think about failure, which I think is overall a problem we have in all kinds of everything we talk about. This is the most important thing. You have to do it. But we're people. We fail all the time. I like to say what it means to be human is just to be bad at stuff. People are bad at stuff. It's the fact of everything. And we don't talk about failure in a way that leads to but keep trying. I mean, there's all kinds of famous sayings. If you first succeed, try again. But in daily life, we don't talk about that. About what we are always going to fail, and so failure is not important. What matters is to keep trying, and that might be what Rosh Chodesh gives us there. But also, I think if we return to the piece about creativity at the beginning, about a creative form of freedom, that we can think about Judaism as itself helping us strive more, meaning doing the mitzvot and participating in that form of religious life externally, even when you're not feeling on the inside, is in fact a good way to help make yourself more into it over time. To return to my perpetual example, davening a minyan is something that over time I feel more comfortable doing. It happens to be particularly davening with the same minyan over time, where I start to know those people, really helps. But just in general, as I do it, it gets more comfortable, and not always. Sometimes it still really bothers me having other people around when I daven. But the process of doing the action of going to the minyan and davening with them and just repeating it over time has in fact changed who I am. And so I think that particularly if you say it's okay that I'm not always feeling it emotionally, participating in it actively and externally can in fact be a way of striving. Anyone else?
Yeah, no, I did have just like a quick thought when you're talking about how sometimes like ritual kind of unshackling. Oh, that's kind of like a mechanism that gives you a little bit more freedom, especially when you don't know what to do. So it just kind of like just thinking about the line that you say, Adonai sfatai tiftach ufi agiti latef. I mean, at a certain point, you're going through something, and okay, so now you want to daven. You daven 3 times a day. You're kiviyachol approaching some sort of whatever existential situation where you definitely aren't sure exactly what it is that you're supposed to say. And if you just stood there every single time thinking about exactly how you wanted to formulate what you wanted to say to God, you would probably never really, never get to even the first draft. So meaning sometimes you might not necessarily be so incredibly passionate about, I don't know, whatever it is, one of the brachot, but you always have something to say. Okay, toch kadei, while you're saying something you can experience or connect to it, but like the Siddur is kind of a way, kind of like an insurance policy. You always have something to say in this particular situation, especially when you're not sure what it is exactly needs to be said.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I have a friend, Rabbi Ari Zev Schwartz, put out a phenomenal set of translations of Rav Kook last year, but he's been really thinking about that idea for a very long time. He's working on putting out a book on, he calls the Siddur triggered prayer. The Siddur is meant to trigger tefillah. And he recommended me once a movie called Finding Forrester with the guy who speaks like this. I remember
Sean Connery.
Sean Connery, there we are. So Sean Connery is this retired hermit of a writer.
I know what scene you're going to talk about.
Yeah. Okay. So there's this teenager from the neighborhood who gets involved with him and has phenomenal writing talent, but no one to teach him, etc. And so there's this great scene where he tells the kid to just sit down in front of the typewriter and write, and the kid just sits there and has no idea what to write. And so eventually, Sean Connery gives him something he's written in the past and says, "Look, just write what you see on the page in front of you until you feel your own words start to flow." That, and this is another important way of thinking about ritual. Very often we think, it has to come from within me spontaneously, but we are not self-contained individuals who are constantly just flowing forth with emotions and things. We're always responding to things outside ourselves. And halacha, one of the things it does, and mitzvah, what they do, is they actually trigger emotional responses from us, and that's one of the many ways that shape who we are. I think you're really right that one of the functions of the Siddur is to trigger more natural, spontaneous, and internal prayers from us.
Great movie.
Yeah, highly recommend the movie. It's phenomenal. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again, Babayit, for hosting. And see you all next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.